So hi everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today's speaker is Maggie Jack, and Maggie has a PhD in information science from Cornell, where she was advised by Steve Jackson, and she has what I find a really interesting background. So a minor PhD concentration in anthropology. This was at Cornell again. And she also holds degrees in history and science from Cambridge and from Harvard. And today we'll be talking about some of her dissertation research. We'll start with that, and then we'll go on to the book project that she's working on. So Media Ruins is the name of her book. And this is a book with in the Labor and Technology series at the MIT Press. And then we'll talk about some of the current work that she's doing in a project, a postdoctoral project with Ingrid Erickson at Syracuse and Melissa Mesmanian at University of California, Irvine. And the later part of our conversation, and hopefully this can be a little more open-ended, we'll also be talking about thinking through technology and design questions when we think about humanitarian crises and war and conflict scenarios. So let's get started. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. So let's start with hearing from you about just maybe your dissertation work first, and then we'll move on to other things. Yeah.
So my dissertation project, well, first, let me just start by saying thank you so much, Neha, for inviting me. It's really wonderful to talk to you too. Your questions are always so sensitive, and thank you everybody for joining. I see a couple familiar faces, but also some new folks. So I'll be really curious to hear your thoughts on some of the stuff we'll be talking about. But just to get started, so for my dissertation, I started working in Cambodia before I started my PhD in 2014 as an analyst for an INGO. And at that time, I was doing some work about how technology was being used in the health sector. But I went there fresh from working from Silicon Valley. I had been working in Silicon Valley for a few years before that. And I was really curious about what does an innovation look like in Cambodia. And I started looking for such a thing in places like design centers and startup boot camps and hackathons. But as I got to know Cambodia better, as I was living there longer, as I started to learn Khmer over that period, and then subsequently when I started doing fieldwork there, I realized that the most interesting things that I was seeing using digital work was actually coming out of the history of Cambodia and the ways that people were recovering historical media artifacts and repairing them and then using social media to disseminate them. And I just found this really creative, really interesting, and really specific to the Cambodian context. So it was something that I wanted to explore more. And so that's what I had the opportunity to do in my dissertation project. And just to give a little bit of background for those who aren't super familiar with Cambodia, it has been recovering from conflict. There was a long period of conflict between the late 60s. Some say that the conflict started when the US bombed Cambodia in 1967 as part of the Vietnam War, but then it accelerated during the Khmer Rouge regime, which was from 1975 to 1979. Which was a genocidal regime. And it was also a time when the ruling group destroyed media from before that period in the early post-colonial period because of ideological differences. So today, so the regime ended in 1979, but because of further conflict, the war didn't really end until Pol Pot died in 1996. So the process of finding materials from before that period has been very protracted. And even today, there are a lot of things that have not been found. So I started working with some of the media creators who were looking for some of these media artifacts, and these included like photography, films. I worked with a group who was surveying old cinemas from before the war period. And they do so by doing a lot of really interesting research, site visits, and then using some digital tools, including things like AutoCAD and Photoshop, and then disseminate them using social media. Another important piece of context for the Cambodian context is that digital tools have grown rapidly in the period that I was working there. So I started working in Cambodia in 2014, and between 2014 and 2020, when I graduated from my PhD program, internet penetration rates had grown from about 6% to like 85%. So this really changed a lot of things, including the accessibility of historical material. So when people found new artifacts, putting them on Facebook was really exciting because it made them accessible to a lot more people than if they had put them in the National Library. So the argument for the project is that this activity, this finding, repairing, and then disseminating historical media artifacts is something that I call infrastructural restitution. So I work from theory of infrastructure. And I argue that this infrastructural restitution is both a form of healing in Cambodia, so the way that media contributes to healing in this post-conflict environment, but it's also a form of political action. So it's a way for Cambodian young media creators to say something about how they want the future of Cambodia to be. And I'm happy to expand on any or all of that if you, whatever you think, Neha.
No, that sounds well, fascinating. A lot of those threads, some of them we've seen here. We've talked about infrastructuring also, and I guess building on that, and maybe we'll come back to some of this also later in the conversation. But how about we move on to what in that has informed your current work? So the work that you're doing on, I guess, creating work life. That's the project with Melissa and Ingrid.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, so let's move on to that first.
Sure. So in the dissertation project, I'm working a lot with theory of infrastructure, and the way that I understand infrastructure, and this is kind of working from mostly SDS and sociological understandings of infrastructure. Lee Starr's work has been very influential in my understanding of infrastructure. But I think about infrastructure as this combination kind of the materiality, the tools of infrastructure, the things of infrastructure, and then work practices. Sometimes those work practices are called articulation work, or the combining of the way that collaboration happens, and a lot of times this work is invisible, and then also relationality. So how do we understand power dynamics within an infrastructure? So those are kind of the three elements when I think about infrastructural work for the most part. And these three elements have been very crucial to the way that my collaborators, Melissa and Ingrid, and I have been thinking about independent work now during the pandemic. So the research question that we have is that we've been working with independent workers to understand how they kind of are continuing to work during the pandemic, and also how they're responding to new pressures to join their professional and non-professional spheres of their lives, which for many during this time have become joined in new ways. And we are arguing, and so the way that we study this is by doing a diary study. So we did, it was an interesting pivot for us because we are all ethnographers, and we were looking for a way to still get some of that quotidian, everyday practice level information. But because of the constraints of the pandemic, we had to do things online. So diary study ended up being a pretty interesting method for us because we did an interview before the diary study, and then 7 days of personal reflection, which we asked for via email. And then at the end, we had a longer interview, which, because of this like sustained check-ins throughout the week, we felt that these final interviews were quite deep and more affect laden than a typical interview can be. because we had developed some of that trust, or even a little bit of that like ethnographic relationship that you get after you kind of hang around with people for quite a while in the field. So what we learned in this project was that people are doing a lot of what we're calling a kind of articulation work, actually, to structure their days and move between their professional and non-professional worlds. So we're thinking about this kind of articulation work as what we're calling a structuring move. And these structuring moves can be in multiple kinds. They can be embodied and spatial and social, like how are you joining different communities that you have. And so to answer your original question about how does this come back to my dissertation project, a lot of the theory that we're working with around articulation work and infrastructuring, this is actually very similar to the kinds of theory I was working with in my dissertation. And another big link is the role of affect in work. I think the COVID pandemic has been extremely disruptive for so many people, including many of the independent workers that we were engaging with during this process. And we found like for almost everybody that kind of pulling themselves up affectively ended up being a really important part of the way that they were able to develop efficacy in their work. And so I think that it's just really brought home to me how important this recognition that we need to be paying attention to that, the affective components of work, even when it's not, the primary thrust of what they're doing in their work practice.
And maybe as an aside, so this is not something well, it just occurred to me when you were talking about this, that there's this piece that you had written for interactions, right? When was it? Last year in March, April. I'll just share a link to that article because I thought it was really interesting. And how do you think the writing of this article kind of connected back to the work that you were doing, that you're just talking about?
Yeah, so it's about so Anupriya Tully and I wrote this together, and we were asked by Interactions to write a piece in November. I think we were asked maybe June 2020 to write something about how technologies are moving around the world, which is something that we're both very interested in intellectually. But we were just like, this is crazy. How can we write about this without writing about what's going on right now? And both of our lives have been so affected by the pandemic. I graduated during the pandemic, and so we ended up writing about how we really need to address kind of autoethnographically the affective resonance of the pandemic and how that has affected our ability to move, and also the way that technology has kind of has played a pretty big role in our ability to move it or feel free, as we talk about in the article. But I do think that this is something that I have personally, I think both through my research, but also personally care deeply about, that I think that if we're not paying attention to this kind of affective dimension of our own work and the work of others, then the work is not as good. It's a lot harder to be thoughtful and creative and ethical if you're not first paying attention to kind of your own embodied and psychological experience.
Right. And I think I'm also biased, I guess, but I think the authenticity also shines through, right? As you're kind of looking at it from an autoethnographic and from an ethnographic perspective. So I guess these are like some of the pieces that I wanted us to continue to build on. One is sort of looking at method and how you gather a deep, rich understanding of the context where you're working, especially when they may not all kind of touch very closely to your life, right? So looking at things, trying to learn about new contexts. And then there's the other piece, which I think also repeats itself, which is around trauma and looking at trauma and collective trauma. And that's something that you and I also talked about a little bit earlier. And I think there's a question that I had written down that we had thought about discussing, which was related to participatory design. So yet another method, and that was how we ground ourselves in our bodies, and I guess like bodily experiences and psychological experiences before doing participatory design. So wherever you want to take this conversation from here, but those are the things that that I'd like for us to touch on a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think to start with your question about how do you gain insight about contexts that are different than your own, I think this is a challenge, and this is a challenge that anthropology and ethnographically informed information science has dealt with for a long time, but it's one that I care deeply about and I've kind of grappled with throughout the years, especially working in Cambodia as a white woman for so long. It's something I thought a lot about, and I think these insider-outsider positions, there's no easy answer, and there never will be. But I think that my answer was sustained community engagement felt like the most ethical way forward and the way to really understand the most about a context in which I wasn't born into. And I think that sustained community engagement comes in a lot of different forms. It means working with people closely who are in communities who have been working on these issues for a long time and will continue that work afterwards. I think I also worked with some amazing research assistants when I was living in Cambodia, and thinking about their career trajectories was really important to me. So like being a mentor to them when they are now applying for master's programs and PhD programs outside of Cambodia, and thinking about how the work can kind of move forward outside of my engagement in Cambodia. And also reporting back my findings in meaningful ways that are accessible and interesting to people who are in Cambodia or in other contexts that are kind of more directly engaged with some of the issues that I talked about. So that includes like giving presentations in Khmer, which is the local language, which is, I guess that's another thing that I really cared about. I learned Khmer, and that was a really big part of my ethnographic process, which was language learning. And so I think just like being as consistent and as conscientious as I could be and engaging. And I think like so I since the pandemic, I unfortunately haven't been able to continue my ethnographic, my like international field work. But I think that sense of community engagement has stayed with me. And I live in Queens, New York, and through the pandemic, I've been very engaged here in community activities. Like I'm in mutual aid. I'm really big into my community compost group, and I am involved with a lot of different, like I did interviews with people who are affected from the pandemic, and contributed them to the Queen's Memory Project, which is a collection of interviews of people who, like essential workers and others. I interviewed food pantry workers and street vendors for the Queen's Memory Project. Because Queens was also super hard hit by the pandemic, and it's a working class community, and a lot of essential workers here. So I think that like kind of transitioning my work in around 2020 when I graduated, and things changed so much with the pandemic, to like really embedding myself here. And I've also started a new research project where I'm kind of trying to understand some of these dynamics in the community projects here. Okay, so maybe that's one part about how do you enter into a new context. I think another part is around the trauma, collective trauma. If we want, I mean, trauma is it's a very difficult concept, and I actually, in my work, I tend not to use the word trauma per se. I try to be as culturally specific as possible. Like in Cambodia, there's quite a bit of pushback about using the word trauma. There's a culturally sensitive term called boxpat, which I use in my writing about Cambodia, which is specifically around symptoms related to surviving the Khmer Rouge period. But I think in the United States, I think it's just undeniable that not only in the United States, but around the world, people are affected by what has happened in the past few years around COVID, around climate change, around the protests of white supremacy and how that's affected people in all different ways, humanitarian crises, wars, now the war in Ukraine. It's just undeniable that this is really impacting people, and this is a moment of immense difficulty for many. And I think it's just very important to acknowledge that. And and think about methods in which we are sensitive to what people might be going through. And to those ends, I've been working with the group to start to formulate a workshop for the upcoming participatory design conference. And we're calling it starts with healing. So how do we center collective trauma in an understanding of participatory design, and thinking about different activities of embodiment through like different senses and mindfulness activities, and how those types of activities can then create kind of a container for people to share and think about futures in ways that might feel safer and more generative for them.
Thank you. So I guess building on that, have you found, or how have you found HCI as a field deals with those questions currently?
Questions of trauma or questions?
And healing, yeah.
I think it's a nascent area. I do think that there is some interest. Nikki Dell is working on some interesting work around trauma in her research group at Cornell. I think that I would love to see more conversations about how to think about trauma and methods be centered. When I was doing my research for my dissertation, a lot of the things that I did ended up being, I kind of had to figure them out on my own or in conversations with my mentors. So I was doing a lot of like personal work to improve my communication. So I was taking classes on nonviolent communication. I was doing a lot of like embodied work to kind of to help with vicarious trauma issues, because I was also doing a lot of oral histories where people were talking about some really difficult things that they had gone through. And also just, trauma sensitive interview techniques. So how do you create an interview modality that feels, again, safe and welcoming to people who might have experienced really difficult things. And I think that, so I do feel like my mentors were really helpful in discussing this stuff with me, and I was able to like develop kind of a group of other teachers with other modalities to learn these skills. But I'd love to see this more structured, like a structured, more systematized attempt to do this in the HCI community.
Thanks, Maggie. And as we're talking about this, and HCI and I guess trauma healing methods, and how there's sort of this mixing of the personal and the professional and the public. I'd like for us to maybe shift focus a little bit. And again, we talked a little bit about doing this prior to this call, but given everything that's going on with Ukraine right now, I wanted to know kind of your thoughts relating to the HCI researchers. First, I just want to ask if we could, if it's okay if we switch focus to that and talk about war and conflict, and as HCI researchers, how we think about these things and how we can be more supportive to our community, but also thinking about the world at large and what our role is as HCI researchers and workers.
So the one thing that I will say, like, is that from my work, what I've learned is that these events have really big ripple effects that are kind of hard to predict, and they last a really long time, longer than I think that we expect. Like the Cambodian conflict started in 1967, and the worst part was in the mid 70s. But this is still a really, really big issue for many people. Not even those who lived with it, but their children and their families and the diaspora. And this is true in many conflicts around the world. I was recently listening to a talk about somebody talking about the Ukraine crisis whose father had been in a concentration camp, and how these things are you know, they're intergenerationally, they matter intergenerationally. So I think that, and the other thing that I think about, and how HCI might want to think about this too, is just the role of technology in conflict, and therefore the role that HCI scholars might need to play to kind of try to rein in the biggest harms of technology when it comes to conflict. And I don't know, I hope that we can kind of come together as a community to think through these things to reduce harm, and know that the impacts of these implementations can just be really damaging for many generations.
Yeah, and I also, quick pause, please feel free to put in any comments, or if you'd like to raise your hand to ask questions. Continuing on that thread, Maggie, you know, we often hear that these are political situations and that we're tech focused, we're researchers or professionals, and that these political scenarios don't have, you know, they're, let me find the right word. So that there isn't really a political side to the tech that we work with or work on. And I'm sure you've come across that in your work as well, right? How do you respond to those types of questions or claims?
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I see them as political questions, but I usually think about them as questions of harm. So how do we reduce harm? I think that is a question that we need to be always asking ourselves.
Harm to whom? Harm to whom?
Especially to marginalized communities. I think harm to everybody, but like, so when I was working in Cambodia, another thing that I haven't mentioned is that in 2017, there was a really big political shift, and the ruling party dissolved the opposition party, and people started being arrested for things that they were saying on Facebook. And this is not unique to Cambodia, but it was really scary for so many people. And what is the role of Facebook in this environment? As an American, I feel some responsibility for fighting for regulations to Facebook, which is an American-based company, that will, so that it can't play as much of a role in some of these really scary events. I don't know, but I think that thinking about different regulatory structures that we could develop in order to kind of reduce some of the human rights issues that we see in which Facebook is entangled. I believe that we need to be doing that more deeply.
Thanks, Maggie. Are there questions anyone else would like to engage further in conversation on any of these topics? Feel free to raise your hand.
I certainly have a question. Well, first of all, thank you. This was really a very interesting conversation, so many interesting topics. I wanted to quickly go back to the beginning of the conversation when you were talking about artifacts and you know, that might have been destroyed. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on how that has changed over time. So I remember seeing pictures from World War II, and in German cities, they would take photos knowing that destruction is about to come and trying to preserve, you know, the look of the city so that they could hopefully rebuild, or for whatever reason, right? But of course now we have many pictures, and I suspect that Cambodia, right, happened obviously before cell phones, but today it's different. We just visited in our town. We have a new middle school, so we went to visit the old middle school and took 1 million pictures, and I'm sure everybody in town did. So probably we could reconstruct a 3D version of our middle school that will be soon, you know, gone. So I'm curious how you think this aspect of HCI and general technology interacts with people's ability to bring things back. And sort of a related question is, how do we even experience these artifacts these days? I mean, I possibly, you know, I love going to museums, but many museums have online, you know, 3D models of what they have, and I'm not going to visit all the museums, but I might interact with them. So people might even start interacting with a lot of these artifacts digitally in the first place. So kind of a lot of questions, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this is, I think, some of the most exciting work that I was able to do. I was really inspired by a lot of the ways that the folks I was working with were finding and reconstructing different artifacts. And these ranged from taking photos and posting them on Facebook so people could just like see images, or even sometimes there were tailored images so that you could kind of imagine what things would have been like without the destruction that had happened. Also, there were like there are all sorts of ways. Like some films were missing parts. So the 1960s was a really big moment for Cambodian film production. And of the 500 films that were made in that period in the 60s, only 100 have been found. And of those 100, like many of them are missing, and they'll just be like, or like there are parts missing. They'll just like find some like random pieces of film reel in a secondhand shop, and then they'll take that little piece of film and then like add some sections that they've made themselves. Or another event that I went to was just so inspiring, where they would play the part of the film that they had and then do a live action performance to like kind of imagine what the rest of the film might have been like. So those are all really creative and interesting things. There was another group who was finding and surveying cinemas, as I mentioned, and they did all like different kinds of exhibitions where they would survey them, they would do 3D models, they would build actual analog models. Again, like a lot of this stuff was presented also digital, so it was like both in person and digital viewing options. And most of the digital stuff was all hosted on Facebook. So as much as I critique the political economy of Facebook, it's also become a tool of a lot of creativity for a lot of the folks I was working with. I hope that answers your question. There's a lot of richness, so in the practices that people had. So it's hard to go into so much detail right now,
Yeah.
but
No,
I'd be happy
you.
to share more.
That's nice. Thank you.
I guess there's also the component of like, putting stuff out on Facebook probably makes it easier for you in some ways to do your ethnographic study.
Yeah, it's funny. Facebook became such a central part of my work in so many different ways. It was a way I connected with people. It was a way I understood better the dynamics between people, or like I, developed stronger relationships. And then a lot of the content was hosted there. And I was also part of my project is archival, and much of the stuff that I wanted to look at, like it was only available on Facebook. It wasn't available also in institutional archives. So, but at the same time, I had these big questions about the ethics of Facebook, and especially in a post-colonial environment where revenue is really being extracted. And I've done other work where I was looking at privacy and Facebook, and the way that Facebook has translated the user interface into Khmer is just shockingly bad. And so, and like this is really, it makes it almost impossible for people who only speak Khmer to really understand the safety tools for Khmer, so for Facebook. So, so I don't know, I have it was a big part of my research, and I have a very complex feeling about the role of Facebook, so.
Cool. I think that we could probably go ahead and hang on a second. We have one more question. So maybe after this, we'll go into the unrecorded portion. But so Navina says, really great to hear your perspectives, Maggie. Could you expand on archival methods and how you went about using them?
Sure. So the first half of my project is historical. So although I mostly talked about the contemporary parts in this, quick convo, one of the arguments of the book is that we have to understand the history of a place when we're doing technology interventions, because the links between historical and contemporary media are very tight, like tighter than I think that we often give credit to in ACM or HCI communities. So I look at the reconstruction of media artifacts starting from directly after the Khmer Rouge in the 1980s. And so to get information about that reconstruction, I did oral histories and archival research mostly in Phnom Penh at the National Archive of Cambodia, the National Museum of Cambodia, and then there's a collection that I used at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and some other digital archives, including the FBIS and some others. But the first few chapters of my project are entirely archival. But I think that Neha mentioned that my undergrad and master's are in the history of science, and so archival methods are something that I kind of hold on to. But I don't know, I believe strongly that we as designers of technology should be more historically informed, because for a lot of reasons. I think especially around these questions of like politics and media, though, because these go way, way, way back. And I think I think when we do interventions, in order to be cautious about how we might be meddling in a different political situation, knowing about the history of the links between politics and media is really important.
And so when you think of, I guess you just touched upon this, but I'm wondering if the work that you did on privacy also drew on your archival methods. So because everything that we're, I guess, generating right now in terms of data about us, about our surroundings and such, they're going into some archive somewhere, right? So do you think you're being well-versed with these archival methods gives you any different insights around privacy-related questions?
It's an interesting question. So the privacy project was an interview-based project, an ethnographic project. So it wasn't historical, but so one thing that I think is related is that that I feel really concerned about the fact that Facebook now holds license to a lot of cultural heritage that people don't completely understand that. And I think this is true around the world, that people don't completely understand the terms and service of Facebook. I teach this as a lesson in class at NYU now, where I'll ask them, like, how much does Facebook own the content that you post? And people are always surprised by how many rights they have to it. But when this is rare, one of a kind material that is only hosted on Facebook, this I think becomes an issue, especially because it's a company that's based in the US. I hope that it's something that we can pay attention to more going forward and think about alternative tools to be hosting some of this material.
There's a question from Preeti. Preeti, would you like to ask this question, or I can read it out for you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. That was really insightful. My question is, you described a little bit about trauma and how this marginalized community often deal with trauma while expressing their, like reviving their memories about these incidents that happened. So how technology can play a role in helping these communities dealing with their trauma and supporting their mental well-being in the longer run, especially during virtual mediums, because right now everybody is not really co-located, everybody is spread apart. And how do you imagine such technology integrated in their current life scenario?
So just to kind of repeat, so the question is, how can media play a role in kind of healing practices? Yeah. So I found this quite a bit, actually, that the people I was working with who are the media reconstructors who I describe in the project, who are finding historical media artifacts, that they told me that this process of finding and repairing them materially ended up being a cathartic experience in many ways, and this was for multiple reasons. One was because the actual process, the material process of handling this material brought positive affect and was kind of an embodying experience. But also, a lot of my participants told me that they felt stereotyped or made unidimensional by the national history of Cambodia, especially to international audiences, that Cambodia is known for the Khmer Rouge and that people are essentialized for being traumatized. And this is something I think that we need to be very, very cautious about when we're talking about trauma. But the reason that doing the infrastructural restitution, which I describe, ended up being a healing action is because it allowed my participants to look at memories from before the war period that were happy, that involved like a complex and multifaceted affective relation that was not just trauma, that was not just difficulty and violence. Like these images of that they're finding in these films or in the cinemas or in the photographs are people just living their lives in Phnom Penh in the 1960s. And I think that raising up these positive affects ended up being really important and meaningful to the participants that I was working with and helped them. They have this word that I really like called Panyaha Plau Hut, which is like the road of your heart. And they would tell me that like finding these positive affects helped them heal the Panyaha Plau Hut, or like help them walk more easily down this road. So I found that very meaningful.
Thank you, Maggie. I think it's probably time to close off the recorded portion of the talk. Does that sound good, Andrew? Okay. And there's, so just before we close, I just want to quickly mention that next week we will have a CHIWORK session, and our chair will be hosting a panel on mixed reality for the future of work. And I think some of the guests are here. So Alberta, Ansa, Nabil, Montserrat, I'm not going to say that name right. So Ayana Seals. And so this panel will be next at the same time. No, it's not the same time. It's 3.5 hours, 3 hours, 20 minutes later. So that would be 7:20 p.m. UTC and then 2:20 p.m. Eastern time. Okay, so with that, let's stop the recording. Thank you, Maggie, once again.